everybody. Good afternoon. This afternoon I visited the Governor-General and Her Excellency has accepted my advice an election be held on Saturday the 7th of September. The time has come for the Australian people to decide on our nation's future because they are the ones who we in this Parliament are elected to serve. Ours is a truly great country. Nobody should ever talk this country down. Around the world we are seen as one of the best countries on the planet, blessed with a strong economy, a hard-working, talented and creative people, and a people who never surrender their deep sense of a fair go for all. These are the values which have steered our country through the first century of its federation, and I believe they're the values which will guide us into the future as well. Australia is too open and positive a nation to retreat into a tight little ball of negativity. This election will be about who the Australian people trust to best lead them through the difficult new economic challenges which now lie ahead. New challenges brought about by the end of the China resources boom. New challenges also that have to be confronted. The boom, of course, has fueled so much of our nation's wealth. That boom is over. This election will also be about who the Australian people trust to steer our economy through the great economic transition that therefore lies ahead. If as a nation we fail to manage this transition well, it will hurt the jobs and living standards of all Australians. So this election will be about who the Australian people best judge to get the balance right, by keeping our economy strong while at the same time protecting jobs, ensuring we have fair wages and fair conditions, continuing to invest in health and education, and above all, ensuring there's a fair go for all. Managing the big economic transition that lies ahead will be difficult, but it is definitely doable. Charting a course through the choppy economic waters that lie ahead will require a steady hand and a clear-cut plan for the future. The new challenges facing our economy will require new ways of thinking, new ways of acting, new ways of planning. One thing I know for certain is that the old politics of the past just won't work for the future. Wall-to-wall negativity doesn't create a single job. Negative personal politics doesn't build a single school. The old politics of division doesn't build a single hospital. Clinging to the past is not going to help build a national broadband network of the future. Three-word slogans don't solve complex problems. They never have and they never will. So Australia needs a new way of dealing with the new challenges we face in the future. And at this election, the Australian people will decide who they trust best to navigate the way through, so that we can have our absolute best shot at maintaining our living standards and our prosperity and our security. But also, on top of that, unlocking the potential which lies in each individual member of the great Australian family, so that we become the best we possibly can. For me, all that was made possible some 30 or so years ago, when reforms by an earlier Labor government made it possible for a kid from the Queensland country, neither of whose parents went much beyond primary school, to go off to university and chart his own future and end up as Prime Minister of the country. Elections are about judgments of our record, just as they are about our plans for the future. In the years we've been in office, we have helped keep our economy strong. While economies around the world have lost tens of millions of jobs, businesses in Australia have added just under 1 million jobs over the last 5.5 years. While economies around the world have tumbled into recession, we in this country, Australia, acting with business, have kept the economy out of recession, almost uniquely across the developed countries of the world. And while others continue to make false claims that somehow this country is in a debt crisis, they can never answer this simple question. If that is the case, why does Australia, among only 8 countries in the world, continue to have a AAA credit rating and a stable outlook? Nor can they answer why the Australian government debt per head of population is one of the lowest across all the developed countries in the world. It just doesn't add up. It's a false claim. and should be named and nailed as such through this campaign. Of course, the business of government is more than managing the economy, although that, for me, is fundamental. The economy must be strong in order to do everything else. We've also kept our economy strong through a series of carefully costed policies during the most difficult of global economic circumstances. This has required hard decisions, like the ones you saw announced last week in the government's economic statement released by the Treasurer and the Finance Minister. I believe it's far better we level with the Australian people about the tough choices we have made, rather than pretend you can somehow wave a magic wand and create $70 billion out of nowhere. I've already said we've made our mistakes in the past. That's true. All governments do, even though most tend not to admit it. The key is to learn from the experience. I said before that elections are both about our record and about our plans for the future. On the economy, with the end of the China resources boom, we can no longer afford to have all our eggs just in one basket. For the future, we must broaden the economic base, diversify the economy. This will be critical for business, for jobs, and for managing cost of living pressures for families as well. That's why the government has embraced a new national competitiveness agenda for the future, and a new way of bringing business, unions and government around one table to deal with our common national interests, which should be much greater and more important than the individual interests of any of us. That's why we also need to invigorate our manufacturing, which I believe to be an industry of the future, not as some believe, an industry just of the past. That's why we need fresh investment in agribusiness, because there are rich opportunities for Australia in satisfying the new food demands of Asia. That's why we also need the great new economic enabling power of the National Broadband Network to help lift our national competitiveness even further. This is the way to build the new industries of the future, right across our vital new service industries as well, which provide so many jobs for Australians. And doing so by responsibly returning the budget to surplus over the economic cycle, supported by moderate budget savings which don't hit jobs, health or education. That's our economic plan for the future. Mr Abbott's plan, by contrast, is a $70 billion slash and burn austerity drive which will cut jobs and cut deeply into basic services and health and education. And if you don't believe me on this, just look at what Mr Newman's Liberal National Party government has done in Queensland, where they said nothing about it up front. They said they'd have a commission of audit, and then lo and behold, 4,000 health workers were then sacked in one state alone. In my community in Brisbane, I've met so many of these folks working in the health sector who've just lost their jobs. Good people, decent people, and I've met them right across Queensland. On education, we've launched a Better Schools plan, a massive $15 billion investment in government, Catholic and independent schools starting next year, so that principals will now have the funds to provide more individual attention for our kids when they need it. And the teachers in my local schools in Brizzy tell me it's a fantastic plan. Unfortunately, Mr Abbott has said our Better Schools plan is nothing more than a con, without putting forward a positive alternative. On health and hospitals, we intend to complete the massive health and hospitals reform plan that we've agreed to with the Commonwealth and the states, massively investing into the hospitals of our country into the future, delivering new services through the National Broadband Network, such as telemedicine, and as well as providing local health services through our local Medicare local network. Unfortunately, Mr Abbott has form on hospitals when previously he ripped $1 billion out of the nation's health system as Health Minister, and now he says he will abolish Medicare Local. We will also roll out Disability Care Australia, our first national disability insurance scheme. And on climate change, our plans are clear, while Mr Abbott, a climate change denier from way back, has an approach he has never properly explained, and it does not work. The Australian people therefore face a real choice for this election, a real choice. A choice between a new way for the future with positive plans for managing the new economic challenges we face, as opposed to the old negative politics and three-word slogans of the past. A choice between a positive plan to invest in new industries, new jobs, health and education, rather than a $70 billion slash and burn exercise which cuts to the bone. A positive plan to connect all businesses and families right across Australia to the national broadband network, rather than one that effectively destroys the NBN and charges households thousands of dollars each to be connected, potentially. The choice also between bringing the nation together behind a positive plan that most of us would readily agree to, as opposed to an approach which tends instead to rip the country apart and to polarise it. That's not my way, that's not my approach. I also don't believe it's the Australian way. Australians, by their nature, are a positive, practical people who believe in nation building, and that approach is part and parcel of the values, ideas and policies we bring to bear for Australia's future. You, the Australian people, over the years have seen me at my highest highs and some of my lowest lows. You've witnessed some of those moments right here, in the place we are standing now in Parliament House in Canberra. Moments that I will never forget, because whether they were good or bad, they've certainly made me a much stronger person. I think as a result, you, the Australian people, know me pretty well, warts and all. I would be deeply honoured to serve you, the Australian people and our country into the future. I know I enter this election as the underdog. In fact, my political advisers tell me if we had an election yesterday, Mr Abbott would be Prime Minister as of today. In the month or so ahead, the people of Australia are going to be subjected to an absolute barrage of negative political advertising, such as they've never seen before, full of daily personal political attacks. Mr Abbott's advertising campaign will be massive, funded by the massive war chest he's amassed from a whole range of vested interests in industry, not least the tobacco companies. So the next month or so is going to be a pretty rough one, I think. That's why I'm asking you, the Australian people, those of you who support a new way of handling the challenges we face in the future, to come on board. We need each and every one of you to volunteer your time, your effort, your enthusiasm, and maybe even send us a $10 donation. Young people, old people, women and men, eighth-generation Australians or migrants who only arrived in this country in the last year or so, because it's only through the power of you, the people, that we will prevail in this election. I have enormous confidence in the sound judgment of the Australian people. I deeply respect our democratic processes, and it's now time for the Australian people to decide. Phil.
Could I just ask
that Phil, then just Phil.
So, you said when you retook the leadership you placed great importance in going to the G20. Obviously that's not going to happen now. Could you explain your change of thinking on that and why the date on the 7th?
Yeah, there's been a number of difficult considerations about deciding upon a date for this election. I think the first is we had to complete unfinished policy business and make some changes, and I think you've seen that. We've done that in relation to our new policy on asylum seekers, which is clear and hard line. We've done that in relation to the position on the carbon price and the floating of the price through an emissions trading scheme. We've also done that in further negotiating the Better Schools Plan, with Victoria coming on board today. And we've done that also with bringing WA on board with its own participation in the Disability Care Australia scheme. So that has been a large slice of work, together with the economic statement which we released at the end of last week, which contained some tough decisions. Then what I've also heard loud and clear around the country is that people believe it's time for an election. I think it's important also for the business community, for business confidence and the rest, that we get on with the business. Because when I look at the things I have had to do, frankly, the unfinished business, we've basically got through. Then there's a couple of other considerations. One, of course, government referendum. I look with some sadness at the fact that the opposition has withdrawn effectively bipartisan support for that referendum, and therefore, regrettably, it can't proceed because it cannot be held earlier than the 14th. I've been a long-term supporter of constitutional recognition for local government, but I think we're going to have to look at that in the next term. Then, of course, there's the question that you just raised, Phil, in connection with the G20. As you know, I'm deeply connected to this institution. I was part of its formation back in 2008. Our plan, and my plan, is that Australia would be represented by Foreign Minister Carr, but we'll keep that under review, subject to international developments in the meantime, and further conversations with international leaders. Putting all that together with Yom Kippur for the Jewish community, which is really important for the 14th of September, and not wanting to get too much into the hair of people when you get to the semi-final season of football, once you get to late September and into October. Frankly, this was the best date available. This Phil over here, then over to you. Phil here, then you, mate.
Okay.
Prime Minister, in your opening comments, you used the word trust quite a lot. In fact, it harked back to John Howard, who used almost the exact same phrase. Why have you chosen to phrase the election pitch that way about asking who do you trust?
Because we have new economic challenges. This is basic for how we approach the next 3 years of the Australian government. We've had a decade-long mining boom. Now the economic circumstances have changed and are changing quite radically. And so it's a fair question to ask, who do you best trust to manage a very profound economic transition? I have, some experience at managing the last one through the global financial crisis. And as you know, a lot of our approaches then were violently opposed by Mr Abbott. So therefore, I think it's a fair way of putting the question. You don't deal with a major transition in the Australian economy brought about by big international changes like the end of the China resources boom through a three-word slogan. It requires a lot of careful thought, and that's underpinned the new national competitiveness agenda that I outlined to the National Press Club recently. Matt? Yeah.
You predicted probably quite accurately that debt and deficit was going to be one of the themes that we hear about.
That's because I read so much of your columns, mate.
5 weeks, yeah. Well said. But just on the surplus.
By the way, if that's the case, why do we have a AAA credit rating, Mr. Probyn?
Maybe you could ask this. I want to ask about your budget surplus for 16-17. Is it a promise, a pledge, or a guarantee, or is it simply a Treasury prediction that might or might not happen?
Well, you know something? Our clear plan is outlined in the economic statement, which was put forward last week by the Treasurer and the Finance Minister. It's there in black and white. We've outlined all the assumptions underpinning it. And the truth is, as they outlined, the revenue assumptions of the government, and frankly many governments around the world, have generally been heading south for a long, long time. That's our plan. It's there in black and white. We've put it out there. And can I just say, Mr. Probyn, that I assume you will exercise parallel rigour in asking, what about the $70 billion that Mr Abbott must either find by way of savings or run himself a deficit of that order of magnitude? It's a very simple choice. Now, I just noticed up until now an opposition running a million miles away from their $70 billion challenge. You know, one deadline, they said they'd have it out to us all by the time of the budget, then it was by some other date, and now some other date. Look, it's time for a bit of accountability here, and it's pretty basic, because economic management will be a core determinant of this election. It's just here first.
Mr Rudd, you've moved to distance yourself from the legacy of the Gillard government. What parts of the Gillard government's legacy do you actually embrace?
I actually am strongly of the view that our Labor government is the product of many initiatives from many ministers, including my predecessor, in so many areas of policy. Let me just give you one example. I think one of the great things we've achieved in education is the system of national testing of the performance of our schools, both primary and secondary schools. That was Julia's work, and I fully embrace it. It's one of the best reforms in education we've seen. Julia is also strongly engaged as a former education minister in the Better Schools Plan. And I endorse that, and I've been working hard on the negotiations, as has Bill Shorten, with various governments. And Disability Care Australia, big reform, kicked off in the 2020 summit here, which many of you lampooned around this gathering. Stop looking so serious, Dennis. You were one of them. and went off to the Productivity Commission, came back, I think just after I last addressed you at this particular place, and then was really worked on by Ministers Macklin and Shorten and by Julia. So these are strong achievements by a reforming government. Behind Latika.
Prime Minister, you've had a lot to say about negative campaigning and negative politics not having a role in this election. What's your commitment on negative advertising? Will you instruct the Labor Party not to embark on any negative advertising against your opponents?
Anything that we have to say about the future will be policy-based, just policy-based. And I'm proud of the policy record we have. I'm proud of the policy plans we're putting forward. But I go back to the simple proposition of why Mr Abbott, up until now, I've been in this job for 5 weeks now, has refused time after time to engage in a public debate with me. I can't remember a time in Australian history when the sitting Prime Minister says to the Leader of the Opposition, will you come into the ring and have a debate? Most of us who've been Leaders of the Opposition wait for the day that a sitting Prime Minister would say, hey, let's have a debate. But he hasn't. And there's a reason for it. And that's because Mr Abbott is uncomfortable with policy, and as Peter Costello said, he is very uncomfortable with economic policy. So I believe there is a huge challenge ahead, both in the advertising space in this campaign, but the public debates as well. Now, can I just say this on public debates? I've received a letter from, I think it's Sky, am I right? Someone here from Sky, wave at me, thank you. For a campaign debate moderated by David Spears tomorrow night. First full day of the election campaign. Well, I'm in like Flynn. I'm up for it. I hope Mr Abbott is as well. And for the other networks, before we get into debates, there's 4 or 5 networks. Pick a Sunday each, every Sunday of the campaign. I'm into that as well. You put together as the National Press Club the panel of inquisitors to throw any question you like. And when I've looked at previous US presidential election campaigns, there are stacks of debates put together by the best journalists in the United States to those who aspire to lead that country. It should be the case here too. Mr Abbott, you can run, but you can't hide, and you certainly won't be allowed to hide behind a megabucks funded negative advertising campaign out of the likes of the tobacco companies. Dennis.
Prime Minister, just on, you're making a great play of economic management in the future, but on your own economic record as a Labor Party, you have actually drastically changed from the May budget, quite drastically on Friday, huge savings, big deterioration in the deficit and in debt. Do you distance yourself from that record of economic management, and do we just now take you on what you're going to do in the future?
Well, what I'd say, Dennis, is you just should level with people. What we're doing through the economic statement last week is levelling with people about the fact that there's been a massive reduction in revenues against those projected in the budget. And if you speak to any finance ministry anywhere in the world, you will find real challenges in getting revenue projections right at the moment because the global economy is so volatile. It's not just a problem here. I'd much rather that we just levelled with people rather than gloss it over. And if ever there's a gloss over job, and I've yet to see a page 1 coverage in the Australian, Dennis, holding Mr Abbott's economic credibility to account on the question of his $70 billion. It's quite a long time since I've seen one. Maybe there was one in the distant past. Maybe it's time there was one. Well, can I just say I haven't seen an analysis of where that $70 billion is going to be met. I assume it'll be in tomorrow's paper.
Prime Minister, you point out a lot of history in this very spot. I think the words you used was you blubbered about 3 years ago. Can I just ask you to reflect on the last 3 years, and is this the fight of your political life? And also, I think you took a quite unprecedented step in your remarks just then of calling for donations and people to volunteer. Are you concerned about what you might come up with, come up against in terms of a Liberal Party war chest?
Well, I think I said very bluntly, that's a fact. The Liberal Party have been running around the place for 3 years, raising a bucket load of money in order to get Abbott into the lodge. Remember, it was Mr Loughnane who said, I think in this city only about 2 or 3 months ago, the Liberal Party had this election won. I think it was Mr Abbott who also said that he'd already begun work on his victory speech a little time before that. That's just a reality. The Liberal Party, funded by a whole bunch of companies, some of which include vested interests, and I find amazingly and appallingly still tobacco companies, is going to outspend the Labor Party massively in this campaign. And so if you think it's unprecedented for a Prime Minister to say to the Australian people at large, if you actually get out there and support an Australian Labor government, and you think what we're doing is heading in the right direction, and you support an open and inclusive society and the sort of social and economic reforms we're on about, then yes, we need your support, including your financial support. I think President Obama did something like this in the United States. I'm all for going out to people and saying, lend us your enthusiasm, your talents, your ability, and even your contributions. That helps. One here? Yeah.
Does it worry you, Mr Rudd, that the numbers in the economic statement were so far out from the budget just 10 weeks ago? Who do you hold responsible for that? And do you think, given the volatility in those numbers, it's not really practically possible to guarantee a surplus?
What I'd say to you is that it's really important to place the challenges faced by our fine Treasury and finance officers into its global context. As I said before in answer to a question, I don't know of any Treasury or Finance Ministry anywhere in the world who's having an easy time at the moment projecting revenues in a highly volatile global economy. And where you've got so many things happening at once, a very sluggish economic recovery, patchiness, a slowing in Chinese economic growth, and given the particular resource intensity of our economy, with terms of trade doing this, it's very tough. But here's my challenge to you. My challenge to you is, what is the real economic debate here? The economic debate, as these two questions would seek to frame it, both from yourself and Dennis, they're legitimate questions, is about debt and deficit. What you don't answer is this simple question, which is, if there is a debt and deficit crisis requiring an immediate return to surplus, why do the credit rating agencies provide us with a AAA credit rating? I don't hear the answer. And so therefore, I'm saying to you, and this is what I'm saying directly, loud and clear, Dennis, is that the real economic question facing Australia is this. How do we manage this massive economic transition coming from a radical adjustment to our terms of trade, which if we don't succeed in dealing with, will affect jobs and also affect the standards of living of all Australians? That's the real economic question. What's our answer to it? A new national competitiveness agenda of the type I've outlined at the National Press Club. That's the real challenge for West Australia, for every state, my state, Queensland, and that's got to be the real response, diversifying the economy, driven by new competitiveness. That's what we're on about. Your framing, the other framing, and Mr Abbott's framing of the economic question is, in my view, a false premise about a debt and deficit crisis, and it needs to be nailed as such. If it was true, why do Moody's and the other agencies regard this as one of only 8 countries in the world with a AAA credit rating? And that I've never had a convincing answer on. Folks, it's getting very late in the afternoon. You're freezing. You've been here slightly longer than me. I've just come from Brisbane. I'm doubly freezing, and I look forward to talking to you again soon on the campaign trail.